From an anthology, So West Lady Killers, Brewery Gulch by Mysti Berry. Bisbee, Arizona, 1935. Little Frances Morgan slipped out of her ramshackle home and looked down at flights of rough-hewn stairs glistening in the new rain. She held a cloth bundle tightly in her hands, hidden under her rough wool sarap. She hesitated before dashing down the first of the flights to get to the street below. Even in the sudden winter downpour, the stairs were the only way to sneak past the spies her pastor had sent out into the night. He was trying to stop women in her church from meeting to learn about family planning. Frances tucked the cloth bundle under one arm, pulled down on her oilskin hat until it kept the rain off the back of her neck, and ran down the stairs as fast as she dared, holding tight to the railings. She knew the sheriff had caught and jailed one of Margaret Sanger's emissaries the month before, but he wouldn't bother the women inside the church. When she had overheard her older sisters arguing about who would smuggle the pamphlets into church, Frances had volunteered. They protested, but she won the argument when she pointed out that if caught, she could pretend she had no idea what was in the pamphlets. Truth be told, she wasn't entirely sure what was in them. She just knew that sometimes women didn't want to have children. Frances thought about how hard it had been on her mother to have 5 daughters in 7 years. If meetings and brochures could make life easier for her mother and her sisters, Frances knew she had to help. Just as her older sister Noy had said, no one looked twice at 11-year-old Frances, Snooks to everyone who knew her, which in the bustling mining town of Bisbee, Arizona, was nearly everyone. The 5 Morgan girls were local celebrities, singing gospel on the radio every now and then. It hadn't stopped them from being poor, her mother pointed out, but it was nice to be noticed most of the time. Snooks didn't even mind her nickname, after Baby Snookums from the funny papers. Tonight, Snooks wished she was less well known. Smuggling pamphlets would be much easier. Luckily, most of the men who staggered past her on the stairs merely nodded as they passed, too drunk to manage a neighborly hello and still keep their footing. The copper mines ran 3 shifts a day, so the bars and bordellos never closed, and men were always returning home or sometimes falling to their deaths down those narrow stairs. Snooks, why are you out by yourself at night? Mary Hall, Snook's neighbor 3 houses down, hung on to a stair railing a few steps below Snooks, breathing heavily. The canyon where Bisbee lay required the poorer folks to clamber up flight after flight of stone or cement stairs to reach homes clustered up the canyon wall. Miss Hall, these steps are steep and you look a little tired. She could smell whiskey on Mary's breath as she joined her on the landing. Mary looked a little pudgier than Snooks remembered, weary, more than drunk, as if she'd aged years in the last month or 2. Mary smiled at Snooks. You girls sounded like angels on the radio. She began to sing a hymn as she pulled herself up the stairs, her thin boots bumping and dragging across the cement. She ruffled Snook's hair as she passed. Snook's family home was 2 miles from the church in Brewery Gulch. She had once run back and forth 3 times in one day when her sister Dee Dee was sick and needed more medicine. So tonight's trip seemed simple enough. Move quietly down the many flights of stairs to the main road and get to the basement door of the church by 7 o'clock. In late winter, it was already dark, and the sudden rainstorm had chased many people indoors. Usually, feeling invisible made Snooks sad, but tonight it comforted her. She continued on down the next set of stairs, clutching the pamphlets under her sarap in one hand, clinging to the cold, wet railing with her other. When Snooks heard heavy footsteps mingling with Mary's, she didn't turn around to look up, hoping whomever was clumping down the stairs would talk to Mary, help her get home safe. Both sets of footsteps stopped, and Snooks smiled with relief. On the landing of the last set of steps, she squatted and pulled her arms back, ready to leap over the giant mud puddle nearby in the road, when Mary cried out. Snooks heard something fall down the stairs, a horrible wet smacking sound, and turned to see Mary lying still at the top of the flight of stairs where Snooks stood. She ran back to help Mary. Blood flowed from around a knife in Mary's chest. Snooks tucked her knees under the young woman's head to help her breathe. Before she could reach to pull out the knife, blood gurgled out of Mary's mouth, and she lay horribly still. When Snooks was sure Mary was as dead as one of the miners pulled out of a cave-in, she gently placed Mary's head on the stairs and stood up, shifting from foot to foot. Snooks said a quick prayer for the young woman's soul. She wanted to run home to her mother, but was afraid of Mary's killer. He might want to murder the only witness. Snooks convinced herself that Mary wouldn't be any less dead if she went to the church first. The mud puddle at the bottom of the last set of stairs seemed like the least of her worries now, and she ran straight through it, mud sucking at the soles of her shoes. The sudden desert rainstorm stopped as quickly as it had begun. Even God is shocked that someone killed you, Mary. Snooks kept in the center of the rain-soaked road, a good arm's reach away from the surrounding buildings. She ran until she was breathless, praying the killer wasn't following her. The church's front entrance was at street level, but Snooks hurried around to the side and down the rickety outside steps that led to the basement entrance. Snooks' last step missed and found air instead, as two very large hands lifted her up and set her on the landing. She nearly dropped her bundle of pamphlets in surprise. Sheriff Bookman, you scared me. He was famous for being the quietest big man in the county, a useful skill for someone who had to arrest drunks and robbers in his work. Sheriff Bookman said, "Little girls shouldn't be running around in the rain and dark." Snooks wiggled out of the sheriff's grasp and turned around. Could he have killed Mary, then taken another route to catch her? She wanted to scream. Instead, she held still and said in a shaky voice, "I'd never get to church in winter if I only went in the daylight, Sheriff. You know we live way up in the canyon." He gave her a gentle poke. "You mind your manners, little Snooks, or I'll tell your mama. Now go get some of the Lord's good word in you. You Morgan girls need all the churching you can get." Snooks nodded and slipped inside, relieved the sheriff was just on his rounds. Saying a brief prayer, Snooks ran in the basement entrance of the church. Inside, the air was warm and dry, and the lamp's glow offered sweet comfort. She shed her sarap and hats, set her overshoes in the mud room next to a pair of muddy boots, and joined the women, including two of her sisters, who sat in a circle. Snooks solemnly handed the pamphlets to Mrs. Gates, the preacher's wife, and settled next to her sister, Noy. "Now, Miss Snooks, you're a bit too young for this." Mrs. Gates stood, her well-worn carpet slippers making her look more like a grandmother than a preacher's wife. Snooks answered back, "I have 4 sisters, and reckon I've seen just about anything y'all are going to talk about." She was surprised at the firm sound of her own voice. Still frightened, she couldn't stop remembering Mary with a knife in her heart. "How do you tell people you've seen a murder?" Mrs. Gates sat back down, tucking her feet under her, and led the meeting in a prayer. Snooks felt safe for the moment. She fidgeted on a rickety chair as the meeting began, worried that Mary's soul might be stuck lingering by her body, or floating overhead, waiting for Snooks to tell someone about her murder. She scarcely heard the women as they spoke about things she really didn't care to know. She wondered how she could tell the sheriff about Mary now that she'd spoken to him and had said nothing. When she hit upon a solution, she could pretend she'd gone back home and found Mary. Snooks settled in, content with her plan. But what if someone had stumbled across the body in the meantime? In Bible class, they never explained how to weigh the needs of an immortal soul against the threat of a caning. The women took forever to finish the reading of the pamphlets and make a list of follow-up questions for the town doctor, as each one struggled with how to talk about things they weren't allowed to speak about in decent society. Snooks couldn't sit still. She slowly drifted back to the mudroom as the women talked, not sure what to do next. She pulled on her overshoes and sarap. Some of Mary's blood had oozed onto her shawl's fringe, so she tugged the fringe out of sight, her eyes fixed on a pair of muddy boots by the door, bothered by them, but not sure why. "What's got into you, Snooks?" Noye asked sharply from the meeting room. Before Snooks could answer, the sheriff pushed open the basement door and slammed it hard behind him. He shouted up at them, "I need you ladies to all stay put for a wee bit longer." He placed a firm hand on Snooks' shoulder and pointing toward the other women with his nightstick. Snooks saw Mrs. Gates slide some pamphlets and the list of questions under a Bible she was putting away, and felt sure the other ladies were tucking away their copies in equally hidden places. Such a fuss over women just wanting a little say in when they had children. Sometimes the grown-ups made no sense at all. Mrs. Gates smoothed her skirt as Snooks sat by her again, anxious to get away from the grasp of the sheriff. She noticed Mrs. Gates' suit jacket had no blouse underneath. Bony wrists and forearms jutted out without cuffs. She wondered if the notoriously tight-fisted preacher Gates wouldn't give her money for a new blouse. With one hand, Snooks plucked at her own ragged cuffs under her sarap, while the other held Mary's blood stains out of view. The sheriff cleared his throat to get their attention. "You ladies are very lucky tonight to be safe. A terrible thing has happened. I feared the perpetrator might be holding you hostage." Snooks saw the sheriff's eyebrows rise a little at the tension in the room. He asked, "You all aren't hiding anyone, are you?" Snooks hid her face so it wouldn't give her away. The other women shook their heads and whispered among themselves. The preacher's wife asked, "What terrible thing, Sheriff?" "Mary Hall's been killed. She died on the steps above the gulch." Snooks left Mrs. Gates' side and hid behind her sister, Noye, hoping to be forgotten. She thought again about the sheriff being Mary's killer. Maybe he was here to find someone whom he could blame. Noye offered, "I helped Mrs. Gates prepare for tonight's Bible meeting." Noye was the best liar of the Morgan girls. She only used her power for good, as she was doing now, to conceal the women's true purpose for being there from the sheriff's prying eyes. "I've been here for a few hours, Sheriff." Snooks knew Noye had to come in just before her. She'd seen Noye's wet coat hanging in the mudroom. "And how about you, little Snooks? Did you see anything?" Snooks willed herself not to look down at the bloodstain on her sarap. How should she answer? Noye filled the silence. "You're scaring little Snooks, Sheriff. Obviously, if she'd seen a murder, she would have told you. Do you think she killed Mary?" The women laughed, and the sheriff's face colored up a little. Snooks stepped out from behind her sister, trembling. "I saw it happen. Well, that is, I heard it." Noye grabbed her little sister's hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" Snooks looked up at Snooks looked up to her sister, vexed. How could she explain without talking about the brochures? Noy coughed and said, "Oh, little sister, you must have been shocked into temporary silence." Noy gave her a sober wink, as if to say, "Good job protecting our meeting." Snooks exhaled, relieved. The other women nodded and whispered to each other, as if they were all too delicate to bear such awful news. Noy leaned close to Snooks and said, "Now you tell the sheriff what you saw. He needs to help to find the killer." The sheriff said, "If you don't mind, I'll take Snooks back to my office." Noy bristled. "You are not going to question my little sister without her mother." Mrs. Gates stepped in between the Morgan girls and the large man. "Sheriff, do you honestly think one of us, the good women of Brewery Gulch, had something to do with Mary's death?" "Mrs. Gates, if you don't all want to be hauled into jail for your Bible meeting, I suggest you step back." Now Snooks was truly frightened. She ran to cower behind her other sister, the substantial Linda Lou. Snooks couldn't forget the sight and sound of Mary's last gasp. She wouldn't let Mary down, no matter how scared she was. Peering out from behind Linda Lou to look at Mrs. Gates, she said, "You know what I saw? You saw it too." The women gasped. "What are you talking about, Snooks?" Mrs. Gates tugged her jacket sleeves down toward her wrists. Noe protested weakly. "Now, Snooks, I said I was here with Mrs. Gates." Snooks shook her head. "Must have been 10 or 15 minutes when you were all alone." Noe looked confused, but nodded. "I did spend some time alone in the kitchen, getting the tea ready." Snooks continued. I can't fathom why, Mrs. Gates, but I'm darn sure it was you I heard on the stairs. You stabbed Miss Mary." Noe said, "What in the world, Francis Morgan?" She and Linda Lou stood side by side as the sheriff stared at Snooks, hands on hips. Snooks walked towards the sheriff, slowly extending the bloody part of her shawl toward him. "See, here, the blood got my syrup while Mary lay dying, but I didn't see blood nowheres else, like on your shirt, boots. So if it wasn't you who did it, Sheriff..." "If it wasn't me..." The sheriff's face twitched, making Snooks shrink back for a moment. "Yes, sir. If it wasn't you, I wondered if it could be someone in this room. I hid Mary's blood by tucking in this fringe. Likewise, someone else here might be hiding something. For example, you might check to see if Mrs. Gates has a blouse with Mary's blood on the cuffs stashed back in her living quarters, because she ain't wearing no blouse." "That's ridiculous, child." Mrs. Gates' face became rigid. Her eyes widened. "Everyone else in this room has a shirt of some kind on. I checked." Snooks crossed her arms. "Child, you have taken leave of your senses." Mrs. Gates turned to the sheriff, pleading, "Sheriff, you can't think a child this young can know who murdered Mary Hall." Snooks kept going, her voice stronger now. "You also have a pair of muddy boots in the hall. If you hadn't left just recently, they wouldn't be muddy. There was time enough for you to go the long way round, so I wouldn't see you and pretend to my sister that you were here when you were really out in the rain, killing poor Mary. There's a whole town full of whore visiting drunks who might have stabbed that tramp." Mrs. Gates stopped herself talking as the women reacted to her coarse language. The sheriff said, "I never mentioned how she was killed. How did you know Mary Hall was stabbed, Mrs. Gates?" The preacher's wife burst into tears. She seduced my husband." She was going to take him away from me when she had that baby. The other women in the room moved away from her. Snooks stayed near her sisters for protection, pained to see even a killer weep all alone like that. The sheriff said, "Ladies, I have to ask you all to wait for me in my office. You won't mind a little rain and one late night, will you? Mrs. Gates, you stay here, please. Snooks, will you go fetch the doctor? And the soberest man you can find to help me here. Quick!" The little girl ran for the door, relieved that Mary's soul needn't linger any longer in the cold and lonely wetness, no longer tied to her broken, lifeless body on the stairs. Snooks shook off the thought and started her search for a sober man in Brewery Gulch, a much harder task than unmasking a murderer.